I've lived in some pretty remote places in my life, but nothing quite like that little house I rented for a winter, right on the edge of a deep, dark forest. It was my first Christmas, living completely alone. I remembered the snow that year was relentless. It started on Christmas Eve afternoon. Big, heavy flakes that buried everything in a thick, white silence. I had a fire going, a glass of something warm, and I was feeling pretty content with my own company. Around 10 o'clock, just as the storm was hitting its peak, I heard a knock. It wasn't at the front door, which was odd. It was at the back door, the one that led out to the woods. It wasn't an urgent, panicked knock, like someone was in trouble. It was slow, deliberate. 3 solid thumps. Pause, then 3 more. My heart immediately started pounding. Who would be out here, in this blizzard, knocking on my back door? No one even knew I was here, besides my landlord who lived 50 miles away. I turned off the living room lamp, plunging the house into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the Christmas tree and the fire. I crept to the kitchen window and tried to peek through a gap in the curtains. I couldn't see anything but swirling snow. The knocking came again. Thump, thump, thump. Patient. So patient. It was the patience that scared me the most. It felt like they knew I was in there, and they were willing to wait. I held my breath, standing frozen in the middle of my kitchen, every muscle tensed. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Someone's knocking on my door. I'd sound crazy. Besides, the storm was so bad, I doubted anyone could even get up the long, winding driveway. I stayed silent. I didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. For a moment, there was just the howl of the wind. Then, I heard a crunch, and another. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the side of the house. I could hear the deep snow compressing under their weight. They circled the house once, slowly, and then the footsteps faded back toward the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair facing the front door until the sun came up, with the heaviest frying pan I owned on my lap. The next morning, Christmas Day, the world was completely transformed. The snow was pristine, a perfect, unbroken blanket, covering everything. I checked the back door. There were no footprints. Not a single track. The fresh snowfall overnight had erased all evidence. For a few days, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, that it was the wind or a branch hitting the house. About a week later, I was listening to the local news on the radio. They reported a home invasion that had happened on Christmas Eve, just a few miles away, on the other side of the forest. The couple was brutally attacked, left seriously injured, and many valuable belongings were taken from the house. The police report mentioned the intruder got in through an unlocked back door. They believed he was targeting isolated houses, possibly someone who knew the area well and used the cover of the storm. A cold dread washed over me that was far colder than the winter air outside. I realized that the slow, patient knocking wasn't for a stranger seeking help. It was for a victim. And if I had opened my door that night, if I had let my curiosity or my Christmas spirit win, that news report would have been about me. I broke my lease and moved out before the end of January. I live in the city now, surrounded by noise and neighbors. And to this day, no matter where I am, I never, ever open my back door after dark. I've been a long-haul trucker for about 15 years now. I've always preferred the night shift. Something about the quiet emptiness of the road just feels right. This story happened on a Christmas Eve, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. A massive blizzard was sweeping across the Midwest, turning the highways into a nightmare of ice and stalled cars. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver, and the main interstate was a parking lot. To save time, I decided to take a detour, a long, winding state highway that cut through miles of desolate farmland. Not the smartest move, but I was young and eager to make my delivery schedule. The snow was coming down so hard my wipers could barely keep up. The world outside my cab was just a swirling vortex of white. To break the monotony, I started scanning through the radio stations. All I got was static. Then suddenly a voice cut through. It wasn't a commercial station. It sounded more like an amateur radio broadcast. Maybe a ham radio operator. The man's voice was calm, almost conversational. He was just talking, describing the night. Then his words caught my attention. He said, "There's a solitary white semi out here, a freightliner, pushing through the storm, a real road warrior." I glanced at my dashboard. I was in a white freightliner. A coincidence, I thought. There must be hundreds of trucks like mine on the road, but he kept going. He's got those twin chrome stacks and a string of amber cab lights. Looks like he's hauling a standard 53-foot box trailer. Every detail was perfect. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. He was describing my truck, right down to the custom lights I'd installed myself. A cold dread washed over me. I fiddled with the radio dial, but his voice was locked in. I noticed something weird. When I slowed down to navigate a sharp curve, his voice got clearer, stronger. When I sped up on a straightaway, it faded into static. It felt like he was close, like the signal was tied to my location. He was tracking me. He started talking about the road ahead, mentioning a specific turnoff a few miles away. He described it as a good place to pull over and wait out the storm. It was all too specific, too personal. My hand was shaking as I reached out and switched the radio off. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the howl of the wind and the drone of my engine. A minute later, I saw it in my side mirror, a pair of headlights, maybe a quarter mile back, keeping perfect pace with me. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. The man on the radio, the turnoff, the vehicle behind me. It all clicked into place. This was a setup, my mind rusted. I couldn't outrun them in this weather, and pulling over was exactly what they wanted. Then I remembered something from my map, an old, abandoned rest stop about a mile ahead. Not the one the voice mentioned. It was a long shot. I signaled, slowed down, and pulled into the dark snow-covered lot, killing my engine and lights. I slid down in my seat, my heart hammering against my ribs, and watched my mirror. The headlights behind me slowed, hesitated for a moment, and then continued down the highway, disappearing into the snow. I stayed there for hours, not moving, until the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. The next morning, I limped into a truck stop and saw the news on the TV. The local police had arrested a group of men who were targeting truckers on isolated roads. One man would use sophisticated radio equipment to find and track a target, describing the vehicle to his accomplices, who would then force the truck off the road and rob the driver. The report mentioned a robbery had occurred just a few hours after I got off the road, on the very same highway. The driver wasn't so lucky. The police said they got a break in the case, because another trucker heard himself being described on the radio and drove straight to a state police checkpoint. That guy saved my life. I finished my coffee, got back in my truck, and finished my route. I delivered the load on time, but ever since that night, I drive in silence. The radio stays off, because sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just a voice in the static, and the knowledge of what people are capable of. This happened a few years ago on Christmas Eve. I was trying to get home, but a last-minute flight was way out of my budget, so I ended up on a late-night bus. It was the cheapest and, as it turned out, the last bus running before the holiday shutdown. The weather was getting worse by the minute. Heavy snow was piling up, turning the world outside into a blurry mess of white and black. The bus was nearly empty, just me, a couple of other quiet passengers scattered around, and the driver, who looked as tired as I felt. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers were the only sounds. We were already running late because of the snow. Visibility was so poor that the driver was crawling along the highway. At a small, dimly lit stop in the middle of nowhere, the bus hissed to a halt. The doors opened, and a man got on. I noticed him immediately because he seemed completely unprepared for the weather. He was wearing just a thin jacket, jeans, and no hat or gloves. He didn't have a bag, not even a backpack. He just walked up to the driver, paid his fare in cash, and then walked to the very back of the bus, taking a seat in the last row. He didn't say a word to anyone. For the next hour or so, the bus pushed on through the storm. I was trying to read, but I couldn't help but notice the man. While the rest of us were dozing or staring at our phones, he was wide awake. He just sat there, perfectly still, staring out the window into the darkness and the swirling snow. There was something about his stillness that was unsettling. It felt like he was waiting for something. The bus eventually pulled into the next scheduled stop, A small, deserted-looking depot. The driver announced the stop, but the doors opened and closed without anyone getting on or off. I glanced back, and the man was gone. The back seat was empty. I figured he must have slipped out so quietly that I didn't even notice. It was a bit strange, but I was tired and just brushed it off. I was more concerned about getting home. About 30 minutes later, flashing blue and red lights appeared behind us. A police car signaled for the bus to pull over. My heart jumped a little. We all sat up wondering what was going on. 2 officers boarded the bus. They looked serious. One of them walked down the aisle, asking each of us if we'd seen a man get on at the last stop. He described the man in the thin jacket perfectly. I told them, yes, he got on, but he got off at the next depot. This is where things got strange. The officer shook his head. He told us that a man matching that description had been found by a snowplow driver on the side of the road, not far from the stop where he'd boarded our bus. The timeline was what made no sense. According to the coroner's initial estimate, the man had died hours ago, well before our bus even arrived at that stop. He couldn't have been on our bus. He was already gone. The police were baffled. They reviewed the bus's internal security cameras. The footage clearly showed the man getting on. It showed him walking to the back and sitting down, but it never showed him getting up. It never showed him leaving his seat or exiting the bus. He was there, and then, between one frame and the next, he was just not. The police had no explanation. They checked every possibility, but the video showed no tampering, no blind spots he could have used. The case was never solved. Officially, it was just a tragic accident. An unidentified man who succumbed to the cold, but they could never explain how he was on that bus. They could never explain the footage. According to the records, according to the time of death, he should never have been there. I think about that night sometimes, especially around Christmas. I wasn't sitting with a person. I was sitting with a ghost in the timeline, a man who was already gone but somehow hadn't left yet. And that feeling, the quiet impossibility of it all, is something that has stayed with me ever since.
Want to hear more stories like this? Hit follow. The night isn't over yet.